Okay, everyone, welcome again. So today's webinar from the Long-Term Care Best Practices program at RNAO is on application writing, how long-term care homes can access funding for RNAO Institutes. And the presenters today are myself, Carol Holmes. I'm the manager of RNAO's Long-Term Care Best Practices program. And with me is Suman Iqbal, who is the Long-Term Care Best Practice Coordinator for Provincial Projects. So for today's webinar, we're using WebEx technology, and you can see on this slide, you'll see the slides through the meeting window. You can expand to the full screen to see the slides. If you prefer, you can also see the participant panel and the question and answer panel on the far right side. Should you have any questions that come to mind as we're proceeding through the webinar, you're most welcome to enter them through the question and answer panel. We will unmute the lines later in the webinar to open up for verbal questions and some discussion regarding your questions. Any questions that you choose to send to us, we will come back to them and we'll review them before we finish the webinar today. So the objectives for today's session is really to take some time with you to explain the purpose of RNAO Institute funding. We'll describe the components of the funding application throughout the webinar. We'll talk about how to prepare an application for funding. We'll discuss the selection criteria that we use and the considerations for funding approval. And we'll describe the process for reviewing applications for funding that we use to make our determination. And we'll also talk about the terms and conditions that applicants have should they be successful and are accepting funding. So the Long-Term Care Best Practices program at RNAO makes this funding available to long-term care homes in Ontario. And we're funded by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. So public dollars used to fund our program are used to support long-term care home applicants in this funding competition. We have a mission to enhance the quality of care for residents in long-term care, and in doing so, create a culture of evidence-based practice by encouraging and working with long-term care home leaders and staff to use RNAO best practice guidelines. And again, we're publicly funded through the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care. So RNAO has 3 learning institutes that we support through a competitive call for funding applications. The institute coming up is the Wound Care Institute, and as you can see by the dates, the clinical stream is being held at the end of February 2017, and the program planning stream begins on March 1st, 2017. The institute that follows that is the Nursing Clinical Best Practice Guidelines Institute with the foundational stream June 11th to 16th and the advanced stream June 14th to 16th. Now these 2 institutes, as you can see, have 2 streams. The clinical and the foundational stream really prepare nurses to actually implement RNAO best practice guidelines. Now, the Wound Care Institute is a clinically based institute where experts in wound care in the province are the expert faculty that actually provide the presentations throughout the institute. The program planning stream there is really designed for leaders in long-term care homes to be able to take advantage of the opportunities to learn more and do program planning around wound care. Likewise, for the Clinical Best Practice Guidelines Institute, the foundational stream is for long-term care home leaders and staff to actually learn more about the knowledge to action framework that is the foundation for implementing RNAO Best Practice Guidelines. And the advanced stream of that institute really prepares long-term care home leaders to be able to do some planning around programs and the implementation of best practice guidelines that support those programs in practice. An additional institute is the Nurse Executive Leadership Academy that will be held in June, late June of 2017. And that's a program specifically for nurse executives in long-term care to be able to come together and learn more about issues and explore those issues related to executive leadership. And it's a cross-sector event, so long-term care home leaders will learn more about issues related to other sectors in long-term care and in healthcare, I should say, and vice versa. So the purpose of RNAO Institute funding is to support RNs, RPNs, and nurse practitioners who are in leadership roles to learn how to implement evidence-based practices. In addition, to build capacity in long-term care homes by integrating evidence-based guidelines in practice. And this is probably one of the most significant purposes of the funding. So while individuals make application and apply for institute funding, they really are the representatives from the long-term care home who is going to go back and actually build that capacity not only in their own individual practice, but more importantly within the long-term care home to actually integrate those evidence-based guidelines in practice in the home. And the institutes also support long-term care home designated leads in program planning, implementation, and evaluation. So who is eligible for this funding? And who should apply for funding? So registered nurses, registered practical nurses, and nurse practitioners that are designated leads for programs are really the best applicants for institute funding. And so for institutes with advanced and program planning streams, such as the Wound Care Institute and the Best Practice Guidelines Institute, those individuals entering those streams really should be nurses that are in leadership and or managerial positions, because they're in positions to be able to move forward with changes in the home and really capitalize on that opportunity to make change and to integrate evidence-based practices into the work in the long-term care homes. For the Nurse Executive Leadership Academy, nurses in executive leadership positions, so really the designated leaders such as directors of care, administrators who are nurses, and nurses in corporate leadership roles would be eligible for application to the Nurse Executive Leadership Academy for funding. So what does the funding include? When we grant funding to those who are successful in the funding competition, it includes the registration fee for the institute, the accommodation that goes with that at the site for the institute, the meals that are provided, and the program materials. There is also reimbursement for economy travel to and from the institute, and we share information about how to access that reimbursement for travel. So it's important to note that this funding is not transferable to another person in the long-term care home. It is granted based on the application of the individual who applies, who is representing that long-term care home in the funding competition. And no cash is transferred to applicants. Rather, the funding is actually transferred internally at RNAO to support that applicant in attending the Institute. So preparing to apply. These are some important points about that you need to think about in applying or considering an application for funding for an RNAO Learning Institute. The first step really, I think, is to discuss the opportunity with your home's administrator or director of care. It really is important to have this discussion to ensure that you're on the right track with your thinking about how this opportunity can benefit your long-term care home. You'll also need to think about the stream that you'd like to attend based on your current experience and role in your long-term care home. And if you have previously received funding, that's one of the questions that we're going to ask about on each application. Are you a member of your professional association? So in other words, RNAO or RPNAO? And if so, we'll be asking you to provide us with that information and your membership number. The rates set for the attendance at the Learning Institutes are based on membership in RNAO or RPNAO, and so there is a preferred rate for members that we will provide. In addition, it's important to know, though, that you don't have to be a member of RNAO or RPNAO to be able to apply for this funding. So the other point of discussion to have with your home's administrator and director of care is around the RNAO best practice guidelines that are currently being implemented or are planned to be implemented in your home, and the rationale for those BPGs that are already being implemented or those that will be implemented in the future. And that's a really important discussion to have, because there needs to be consistency between what you are applying for and what your home is providing the support in terms of your time and the letter of support that will be provided that goes along with your application for funding. So a few tips on completing the application. And after this, we'll get into more detail about what the components of the application actually involves. So first of all, we have an online application form, and it's accessed through a link in the funding announcement. And for the current round of funding, we sent out that funding announcement just about a week ago on Tuesday, December the 6th, and that's for the funding that's coming up for the Wound Care Institute in the new year. In addition, gather all of your information together. It's best when you sit down to actually complete the funding application online that you've got all of your information pulled together. So you're also going to want to clearly describe your leadership role in implementing best practice guidelines in the long-term care home in which you're working. Also clearly state the rationale for the BPGs that are selected in supporting the organizational goals and program planning process that is underway in your home. And to ensure that there's consistency between the information in your application that you submit and the letter of support around the BPGs selected for implementation, your leadership role, and the rationale for those BPGs being selected. These are all the areas that we've found in the past that have been somewhat unclear or perhaps deficient in the funding application. So we wanted to bring those to your attention through this webinar. And so I'm now going to pass things over to Suman, who will continue with the discussion around the letter of support and other aspects of the funding application.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to talk to you about the letter of support that Carol was just talking about. Now, we're looking at what information that your director of care or your administrator should include in this letter. We're looking at a description of the applicant's role and responsibilities, and further, we're looking for what are the expectations of the long-term care home regarding how you, as the applicant, will integrate this knowledge from the Institute to enhance your program planning and evaluation. How is the organizational support in place or will be in place for you to actually make these changes to the practice or to the program? And then also we need to see some consistency in why are these best practice guidelines being selected to be implemented in your home. That is really important because that helps us understand why you're choosing these specific guidelines. The other one that we're looking for is to see what approaches do you have for sharing this learning within your organization, and then how have you met with, so these are actually just some examples of how you could share the learning when you go back after the institutes. Meeting with your home leaders to review what the learnings were any ideas or strategies that you learned that you could implement in your organization, meeting with the program team members to share some of the key learnings, identify some of the current meetings and forums that are already in place to share this learning if you're implementing this guideline on a unit or on the organization as a whole. You can also look at identifying the actions for integrating the best practices into your program plans. And the other things that we ask you to do is to consult with the RNAO Long-Term Care Best Practice Coordinator for your home. So we're going to talk about now is the application review and what are some of the areas that we consider when we are actually doing the review of these applications. So first and foremost, the application needs to be complete, which also includes the letter of support, and it needs to be submitted by the due date and the due time, which is listed on the email that was sent out. So this is very important. If an application is incomplete, we will not be reviewing it. Applicant who is in a role or a position to implement the change for practice or for program planning and evaluation is another area that we look at. We also look at the rationale for selecting the best practice guidelines for implementation and that they're thoroughly described. We look at what the applicant's strengths and skills are in leading and championing best practices as they're described in the application. So we're going to continue on application review. The other area that we look at is the description on how the applicant will share this learning, and we already shared some of the examples of that. We look at how the applicant will involve the long-term care best practice coordinator from RNAO in the planning and implementation process of these best practice guidelines. And then we also look at the letter of support from the director of care and from the administrator to see if there's consistency between the application and the letter itself, and to talk about how the applicant will be supported in leading, implementing, and sustaining these best practices within the home. So one of the things that we want you to look at when the application starts is we ask you about questions that are something very specific to your demographics. We ask you for your name, your credentials, the name of your director of care, have you received previous funding, and as Carol mentioned before, we look for your membership information with either RNAO or RPNAO if you are a member. And also to make sure that you choose the stream that you're applying for. Now, all these things that we discussed Items are scored with equal weight for each area. So terms and conditions. These are specific that all applicants are subject to review. Each one of them is reviewed carefully. And just make sure that just because you're submitting an application does not mean that your funding and registration or participation is confirmed. And as mentioned before, only completed applications and letter of support that are received by the due date and the time will be considered. Successful applicants are expected to meet with the RNAO Long-Term Care Best Practice Coordinator to discuss the plans and expectations your long-term care home has for you as an applicant to integrate this knowledge that you've gained at the Institute and making changes to your program. Successful applicants have to attend the entire program and they have to stay on site. These institutes are usually held at some event location where you're required to stay during the day and overnight, as some of the sessions do take place later in the evening. Funding is not transferable to another person in the long-term care home, and at time of attending the institute, the successful applicant has to be employed at the long-term care home that supported their application. And those that are already registered for the Institute are not eligible to apply for this funding. So some of the next steps that we have, watch out for the call of funding applications disseminated through an email from RNAO, and as Carol mentioned, that was sent out on December 6th. We will resend this email information with a link to this recording of the webinar early in January so that you have that information again. Make sure you review all the eligibility requirements and also discuss this opportunity and your attending the institutes with your long-term care home leaders. Identify how you will use this knowledge that you have gained at the Institute to enhance practice and resident outcomes. And again, consult with your RNAO Long-Term Care Best Practice Coordinator. Complete the online application by the due date and make sure that the letter of support is also received by RNAO Home Office by the due date and the due time. So this map of Ontario shows you where who the long-term care coordinators are. They work with the long-term care homes within the LHIN, and at this time, LHIN 5, Central West, is currently vacant, so please contact Sima Sheikh for that area. We also have their contact information, so we've provided their email information to you. That you can reach each one of them, and we will also share the main email for the long-term care home office that you can also reach us for that. And we will now open the lines for questioning. Carol's going to unmute the line, but if your lines are muted, press *7.
The conference has been unmuted. Le mode discrétion a été enlevé de la conférence.
You can also ask the questions online.
Does anyone have any questions? We'll be happy to respond to any that you have. Okay, I'm not hearing any questions, so we have a couple of questions that have come in online. So the first one, is this applicable to home care? So the answer to that would be no. This is specifically for long-term care homes that are licensed in the province of Ontario. And that is what our funding is designated to support. And another question, when will the funding announcement come out for the other two institutes? So we currently have the call for funding out for the Wound Care Institute. That will be at the end of February. We usually get our funding announcements out about 2 months in advance of the event. So you can keep that in mind. And please always watch for our emails. We have a very large distribution list of contacts across the province in long-term care homes, leaders and staff, and the long-term care best practice coordinators actually identify the people that are on those mailing lists, and we bring them, and we use those mailing lists to disseminate the announcements. So another question has come in asking, will funding be available for home care? I'm not aware that there will be any funding coming forward for home care. That would really be dependent upon the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care moving forward with making funding available for other sectors. So the Long-Term Care Best Practices Program at RNAO has been funded by the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care since following a 3-year pilot project that was from 2005 to 2008, and our funding has been in place to support long-term care homes in Ontario since 2008. So before we wrap up, I'll ask again, are there any additional questions that you have about this funding opportunity? Not hearing any from you, so what I will suggest to you that should you have any questions that come to mind as you're thinking further about submitting a funding application, please feel free to email us. We have a program mailing, LTC BPP, or Long-Term Care Best Practices Program, at rnao.ca, and you can certainly send an email there. The other opportunity that you have, those of you working in long-term care homes, is to connect with the long-term care best practice coordinator in your area of the province. We will be happy to distribute these slides to those of you who have attended, and certainly if in future you're looking for more information, please contact us through our program email, and we'll be happy to respond to that and connect you with the most appropriate person around your question. And so the long-term care best practice coordinators across the province are available to work with you in your long-term care homes and assist with the implementation of RNAO best practice guidelines. And one of the ways that we really look forward to doing that is through those of you who are successful in an institute funding to be able to work with you specifically around the needs that your long-term care home has to use RNAO best practice guidelines. One more question has come through online, and is the clinical counseling psychotherapy unit included? I'm afraid I don't know what that refers to, so I'll invite the person who has asked that question to say a little bit more about that, and Suman and I will see if we can respond to that. If that's a best practice guideline, it isn't an RNAO best practice guideline. So please feel free to contact us further about that if you'd like to talk about that any further. And so again, our email address, ltcbpp@rnao.ca. So thank you very much for joining the webinar today. We will be posting the recording of the webinar on the RNAO website, and you're also welcome to contact us. Thanks very much for joining.
好，结束了，谢谢。那要不然的话，我就准备要回家去听了。对啊。